June 1968, Phu Thai Province, South Vietnam. While American units were taking 60% casualties on helicopter insertions, one group of soldiers walked into the jungle and walked out alive. This is the story of why the Australian SAS chose their boots over rotor blades, and how that decision became the difference between survival and slaughter. Sergeant Jack Morrison crouched in the briefing tent, the humid air thick enough to taste. Around the wooden table sat his three-man patrol, Corporal Danny Wright, barely 23 but already on his second tour, Trooper Mike Chen, whose eyes held the quiet intensity of a man who lived in the jungle, and Trooper Paul Henderson, the medic whose pack always weighed 10 kilos than everyone. Major Thompson stood at the front, pointer in hand, tapping a map of dense green terrain. The mission was straightforward on paper. Intelligence reported a Viet Cong supply route running through the dense jungle northwest of Nui Dat, their base. The Australian task force needed eyes on that, needed to know numbers, frequency, equipment, standard reconnaissance. What wasn't standard was how they would get there. Major Thompson's pointer traced a line on the map. The target area was marked in red, 20 kilometers deep into territory, where the Viet Cong moved freely. Danny Wright leaned forward, expecting to see helicopter landing zones marked near the objective. Instead, the pointer stopped at a clearing 15 kilometers away. Morrison knew what was coming. He had done this dance before. Wright, however, was still learning. The major's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. Four-man patrol, insertion by Huey to a cold landing zone, 15 kilometers southeast of the target. From there, 3-day approach march on foot through primary jungle. Establish observation post overlooking the trail, 48 hours surveillance. Extract on foot to a secured landing zone, location to be determined based on tactical situation. Wright's hand went up. The question was predictable. Why not insert closer? Why not drop them right on top of the objective and save 3 days of walking? Major Thompson didn't smile, but Morrison saw the flicker of expectation in his eyes. The major had heard this question from every new trooper, and his answer never changed. He pulled out a folder, let photographs spill across the table. Black and white images, some still smelling of developer chemical. Bodies in helicopter landing zones. American soldiers cut down in the moment of insertion, caught in the fatal seconds between leaving the helicopter and finding cover. The statistics were brutal, Thompson. Hot landing zone insert, where helicopters dropped troops directly into or near operational, were producing casualty rates between 40 and 60% when the enemy was prepared and waiting. The sound of a Huey carried 5 to 10 kilometers through jungle. The Viet Cong weren't stupid. They knew every clearing, every potential landing zone. They knew the Americans loved their helicopters, so they watched the clearings and they waited. Henderson, the medic, spoke up. His voice carried the weight of a man who had treated wounds that statistics couldn't capture. He had seen what happened when surprise belonged to the enemy. Rotor wash kicking up dust and debris, visibility zero, noise drowning out incoming fire, men stumbling off ramps into killing zones they couldn't see. Speed meant nothing if you were dead before your boots hit the ground. Chen, who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, added his piece. The jungle was their ally if they respected it, their enemy if they fought it. Walking took time, demanded physical endurance that broke weaker men, but it brought something no helicopter could deliver: complete tactical surprise. If the enemy didn't know you were coming, they couldn't prepare an ambush. If they didn't hear you arrive, they couldn't track your movement. The jungle swallowed sound if you moved carefully, but it amplified noise if you were careless. A helicopter was careless by definition. Wright absorbed this, nodded slowly. Morrison saw the understanding dawning in the younger man's eyes. Speed versus stealth. The Americans had chosen speed and were paying for it in blood. The Australian SAS had chosen stealth and were walking home alive. Thompson concluded the briefing with the doctrine that separated them from their allies. If you need a helicopter to get there quickly, the enemy knows you're coming. The Australian SAS squadron, operating in Phu Thai Province from 1966 to 1971, would record 0 casualties from hot landing zone insertions for one simple reason. They didn't do hot insertions. Extraction by helicopter was planned meticulously. Landing zones secured first, smoke deployed for obscuration, covering fire established. Helicopter extraction was necessity, not standard procedure. The patrol had 48 hours to. Packs were loaded and weighed. 45 kilograms each, 50 for Henderson with his medical supplies, rations for 7 days, water for 2 with purification tablets for resupply, ammunition that made the packs impossibly heavy, radio equipment that Wright would carry, medical kit that Henderson distributed between them all. Every item was examined, weighed, questioned. If it wasn't essential for survival or mission success, it stayed behind. Morrison watched his team prepare with the eye of a man who knew that preparation was the first phase of combat. Chen checked and rechecked his compass, map, protractor. Navigation through primary jungle with limited visibility and no landmarks was unforgiving of errors. A single degree off course compounded over 20 kilometers could put them kilometers from their target. Wright tested the radio repeatedly, encrypted frequency, emergency protocols, extraction. Henderson organized medical supplies with methodical precision, bandages and morphine and tourniquets arranged for access in darkness. The philosophy was simple but absolute. In the jungle, weight was suffering and suffering was inevitable, but death was optional if you were careful enough, patient enough, quiet enough. Dawn came with the sound Morrison both relied on and resented. The Huey's rotors beat the air into submission, that distinctive whop-whop that traveled kilometers. But this morning, that sound was carrying them to a cold landing zone, a secured clearing where the only threat was the jungle itself. The flight lasted 20 minutes. Morrison watched the terrain below, endless green canopy broken by occasional clearings and the brown ribbons of rivers. From the air, it looked peaceful. From the ground, it was anything but. The pilot brought them in fast and low, flared at the last second, and the skids touched grass that had been checked hours before by another patrol. 10 seconds. That was 10 seconds from skids down to skids up. Morrison's team moved like they had trained, like they had done this dozen times before because they had. 4 men out, spread in defensive positions, Huey lifting off before the last man cleared the rotor. The sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, and then there was only jungle silence. No enemy fire, no ambush, no casualty. This was a cold landing zone, 15 kilometers from where the enemy expected them, and that distance was their insurance policy. Chen took point immediately, compass in hand, map committed to memory. The approach march began. 15 kilometers as the crow flies, translated to 3 days of movement through terrain that resisted every step. Primary jungle in Vietnam wasn't the Hollywood version of convenient paths and visible horizons. It was walls of vegetation, slopes that turned ankles, heat that sapped strength, humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. The pace was glacial by design. 2 kilometers per day when moving through enemy territory. Every step calculated, every noise evaluated, every sign of enemy presence catalogued. Chen moved like a ghost, reading the jungle in ways that seemed almost supernatural to men who hadn't spent years learning the language. Broken branches meant recent passage. Disturbed soil meant foot traffic. The smell of cooking fires carried on the wind told them humans were near. Morrison kept the patrol spread in tactical formation, 15 meters between each man, close enough for visual contact in the dense vegetation, far enough that a single ambush couldn't take them all. Wright, carrying the radio, stayed in the middle of the formation where he was most protected. Henderson brought up the rear, medics' eyes constantly scanning for threats from behind. The weight of the packs became apparent within hours. 45 kilograms pressed down on shoulders, hips, backs, straps cut into flesh despite padding. Every uphill slope was a test of will. Every stream crossing risked a twisted ankle that could end them. The humidity soaked through their uniforms, salt stains marking where sweat had evaporated and been replaced by more sweat. But they were silent. This was the critical difference. They moved at a pace that allowed absolute noise discipline. No talking beyond hand signals, no breaking of branches, no disturbance of vegetation that would mark their passage. When they moved, the jungle absorbed them. When they stopped, they became part of it. The first night was textbook precision. As light faded, Chen found a position off any trail, any natural line of movement. They established a patrol harbor, a small defensive position where they would spend the hours of darkness. No fire, no light, no sound. Cold rations eaten in silence, water consumed sparingly. 2-hour watch rotations, each man sleeping with his weapon, ready to move in seconds if compromise came. Morrison lay in the darkness, pack as pillow, listening to the jungle night. It was never truly silent. Insects, birds, animals created a symphony of sound that was both cover and alarm. The trick was learning which sounds were natural and which were warnings. A sudden silence meant predator nearby, and in this jungle, humans were the apex predators. Day 2 brought the reality of walk-in operations into sharp focus. Muscles that had been merely sore became properly painful. Blisters formed where skin rubbed against boot leather, despite precautions. The weight of the packs seemed to increase with every hour. gravity itself becoming an enemy. But they maintained pace, maintained discipline, maintained silence. Chen navigated with precision that bordered on art. Using compass, map, and terrain association, he kept them on course through jungle where visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters. Dead reckoning in an environment that offered few reference points, where every tree looked like the last one and every slope felt identical. Morrison trusted Chen's navigation absolutely, had to trust it, because being lost in enemy territory was a death sentence that arrived slowly. Wright was learning the lessons that briefings couldn't teach. He was learning that slow was fast, that patience was aggression, that the absence of contact was victory. Every hour they moved undetected was an hour they controlled the tactical. Every kilometer they covered without alerting the enemy was a kilometer closer to their objective, surprise intact. Henderson, despite carrying the heaviest pack, maintained the pace without complaint. His philosophy was simple. The best medicine was avoiding injury, the best treatment was preventing wounds. Every casualty they didn't take because they walked instead of flew was a patient he didn't have to treat with limited supplies in hostile territory. By the end of day 2, they had covered 8 kilometers. To an outsider, it seemed absurdly slow. Morrison knew it was exactly right. They were moving at the speed of tactical perfection, the speed that left no trace, made no sound, created no opportunity for the enemy. The third day brought them into the operational. Chen's navigation had been flawless. They were within 1 kilometer of the target trail. Now the pace slowed further. Chen spent 10 minutes observing before each movement, looking for signs of enemy presence, ambush positions, booby traps. The Viet Cong were masters of their environment, and complacency here was fatal. Morrison called a halt. They would establish their observation post during daylight, use the remaining light to prepare their position, then begin surveillance at first light. The location Chen selected was textbook, elevated position with clear view of the trail below, multiple escape routes, natural cover, minimal approach angles for enemy. They spent 4 hours preparing the position with the same meticulous care they had brought to the vegetation cleared silently to create sightlines, debris removed to allow quiet movement, firing positions established for each man, escape routes rehearsed. When they finished, the position was invisible from the trail below and defensible from all approaches. As they settled into position, Wright heard it. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. The sound of helicopter rotors. Morrison heard it too, and his expression hardened. That sound was coming from the wrong direction, too close to the operational area. Through the canopy gaps, they could see it. A formation of 4 Hueys, flying low, heading toward a landing zone no more than 3 kilometers from their position. An American insertion, exactly the kind of operation the Australian SAS avoided. Morrison didn't need to see the landing zone to know what was about to happen. The Viet Cong had heard those helicopters from 10 kilometers away. They knew exactly where those Hueys were heading because there were only 3 clearings large enough for landing in that direction. And if Morrison had been Viet Cong, he would have had ambush teams at all 3. The sound of helicopter rotors changed pitch, the Hueys flaring for landing. Then came the sound that Morrison had heard too many times before, the sound that statistics couldn't capture. The sharp crack of AK-47 fire, the deeper boom of RPGs, the sustained roar of a prepared ambush executed perfectly. The Americans had achieved speed, had put their troops on the ground in minutes instead of days. And the Viet Cong had been waiting. Wright's face went pale. He was hearing men die, men whose commanders had chosen speed over stealth, helicopter insertion over walk-in approach. The firing continued for minutes that felt like hours, then faded into sporadic shots, then silence. The extraction helicopters came in later, and Morrison knew they would be carrying more bodies than living soldiers. Chen broke the silence with a whisper. That could have been them. One decision, helicopter versus boots, survival versus casualty rates that ran 40 to 60%. Morrison nodded. That was the decision Major Thompson had made, that every Australian SAS commander made. Time versus surprise, speed versus stealth, helicopter mobility versus walking infiltration. The Americans had chosen differently, and good men paid the price. Henderson's medical instincts made him want to help, but Morrison shook his head. Their mission was reconnaissance, and compromise would help no one. They were here because they had walked, because they were unknown, because surprise belonged to them. Breaking silence to assist an operation 3 kilometers away would sacrifice that advantage and likely get them killed in the process. That night, the patrol maintained absolute silence in their observation. No movement, no sound, no light. They had witnessed the consequences of detection, and it reinforced every doctrine they followed. Dawn brought the Viet Cong. Morrison watched through binoculars as they moved down the trail below, and his estimation of enemy strength revised upward with every passing. This wasn't a small supply unit. This was a battalion-sized element moving with confidence through territory they controlled. Packs laden with supplies, weapons well-maintained, discipline evident in their movement. Wright photographed the movement with a specialized camera, manual advance to avoid the sound of motor drive. Every frame was intelligence, unit size, equipment, direction of travel, timing. This was what they had walked 3 days to obtain, information that helicopter insertion would have made impossible to gather because the enemy would have known they were there. For 48 hours, they observed and documented. The trail saw constant traffic, more than intelligence estimates had suggested. Henderson counted supplies, made notes on equipment. Chen mapped the trail route, identified where it connected to other paths. Morrison assessed tactical options, defensive position, ambush point. Wright transmitted encrypted burst transmissions back to base, short packets of data that minimized radio. The Viet Cong never knew they were being watched. The Australian patrol was 15 meters from the trail, invisible in their prepared position, silent as the jungle itself. This was the ultimate tactical advantage, complete information without enemy awareness. Morrison thought about the American operation 3 kilometers away. The casualties taken in the moment of insertion, the mission compromised before it began. Speed had gotten those men killed. Patience was keeping his team alive. On the evening of the second day of observation, Morrison made the call. They had the intelligence needed, had documented pattern of life on the trail, had assessments of enemy strength and logistic. Time to extract. But extraction by helicopter required preparation, that hot insertion. Chen identified 3 potential landing zones, all more than 2 kilometers from position. Distance from the observation post meant the enemy couldn't connect helicopter sounds to surveillance activity. Morrison selected the most defensible zone, the one with the best approaches and escape route. The extraction sequence began with movement. The patrol withdrew from their observation post during darkness, erased signs of their presence, and moved toward the landing zone. 2 kilometers took 6 hours in darkness, every step carefully placed, every sound monitored. By dawn, they were in position around the landing zone, and Chen was checking it for enemy activity and booby traps. The landing zone was clear. Morrison had Wright transmit the extraction request with their location encrypted in code. The response came back, extraction in 4 hours. That meant 4 hours of securing the landing zone, 4 hours of vulnerability, 4 hours of ensuring that when the helicopter arrived, it would be landing in a cold zone, not a hot one. The patrol established defensive positions around the landing zone perimeter, overlapping fields of fire, positions that allowed them to spot enemy approach before they reached the clearing. Henderson prepared smoke grenades for obscuration, yellow smoke that would mark the landing zone for the pilot and create visual cover against observation. Wright had the radio on emergency frequency, ready to wave off the extraction if enemy appeared. This was the difference, Morrison. The Americans often extracted under fire, helicopters coming into hot landing zones because the inserted troops had been compromised from the start. The Australian SAS secured the landing zone first, ensured the helicopter would face minimal threat. Extraction was planned, controlled, safe, or as safe as anything could be in a war zone. The sound of the Huey came right on schedule. Morrison popped smoke, yellow cloud billowing in the clearing. The pilot confirmed color over radio, guard against enemy deception. The Huey came in fast, flared hard, skids touching ground. The patrol moved in practiced sequence, 15 seconds from positions to aboard. The helicopter lifted immediately, gaining altitude and speed, clearing the area before enemy reaction was possible. They were out. 7 days in enemy territory, 3 days walking in, 2 days observing, 2 days walking out. 0 casualties, 0 compromise, full intelligence gathered. Mission success, by the only metric that mattered. They had survived to bring back what they learned. Back at Nui Dat, Major Thompson reviewed their intelligence while the patrol cleaned weapons and filed reports. The photographs and observations would shape future operations, give commanders understanding of enemy movements and strength. This was what reconnaissance meant, what justification existed for the SAS mission. Morrison sat with his patrol that evening, drinking tea that tasted like luxury after days of metallic water from canteen. Wright was quiet, processing what he had experienced. The sounds of the American hot landing zone ambush still echoed in his mind, contrast stark against their own successful insertion and extraction. Henderson checked everyone for jungle rot, blisters, infection. 3 days of walking with 45-kilogram packs had taken physical toll. Feet were blistered, shoulders rubbed raw where straps had pressed, backs aching from constant. But these were minor injuries, treatable with basic first aid. Nothing compared to the casualty rates helicopter insertions. Chen was already studying maps for the next patrol, already planning the next walk-in approach. For him, this was the rhythm of war. Walk in, observe, walk out, repeat. The monotony broken by moments of absolute tension, the physical suffering offset by tactical success. Morrison wrote his after-action report, documentation required by military bureaucracy. The words were clinical, professional, but beneath them was a truth that numbers captured better than prose. From 1966 to 1971, the Australian SAS squadron operating in Phuoc Tuy province recorded 0 casualties from hot landing zone insertions because they simply didn't conduct hot insertions. Their casualty rates were among the lowest of any unit operating in Vietnam, not because they avoided combat, but because they controlled when and where combat occurred. The American doctrine of airmobile operations was revolutionary, enabled coverage of vast terrain, allowed rapid response to intelligence, but it had a fatal flaw. It announced arrival. It forced insertion into known locations. It created moments of maximum vulnerability. In operations where the enemy was prepared and waiting, helicopter insertions produced casualty rates between 40 and 60%. Those weren't just statistics. Those were men who died in the seconds between leaving a helicopter and finding cover. The Australian SAS had looked at those numbers and made a different choice. They chose boots over rotors, stealth over speed, surprise over rapid response. They chose to walk into the jungle carrying impossible weights over impossible distances through impossible terrain. They chose to take 3 days to reach objectives that helicopters could reach in minutes, and they chose to walk home alive. The trade-off was understood and accepted. Walk-in operations limited operational range, required extreme physical fitness, took time that reduced overall mission frequency. A patrol that spent 7 days on one mission could have conducted 3 helicopter-inserted missions in the same time frame. But those 3 missions might have produced casualties that walk-in operations avoided. The philosophy was captured in a single sentence that Morrison had heard from British SAS advisors, passed down from generations of special operations soldiers who had learned that patience was a weapon. If you need a helicopter to get there quickly, the enemy knows you're coming. This wasn't cowardice disguised as tactic. Australian SAS patrols engaged the enemy when necessary, fought when compromise occurred, extracted under fire when situations demanded it, but they fought on their terms, with surprise on their side, with the enemy unaware until contact was initiated. They fought when they chose to fight, not when the enemy chose for them. The helicopter remained a tool in the Australian arsenal, essential for insertion to cold landing zones, critical for emergency extraction, valuable for rapid deployment when stealth wasn't required. But it was a tool used with discipline, understanding its limitations as clearly as its capabilities. The sound of rotors was tactical information that traveled kilometers, information the enemy would act upon. Wright understood now, understood why they had walked when helicopters were available, understood why 3 days of suffering was preferable to 60% casualty. He understood why Chen could navigate through featureless jungle with only compass and map, why Henderson carried extra weight without complaint, why Morrison made decisions that prioritized patience over speed. He understood that in the jungle, slow was fast, and quiet was loud, and walking was flying. The lessons learned in Vietnam would influence special operations doctrine for decades. The balance between mobility and stealth, between speed and surprise, between technological advantage and tactical fundamentals. Helicopters offered capabilities that walking could never match, but walking offered advantages that helicopters could never provide. For the Australian SAS in Phuoc Tuy province from 1966 to 1971, the choice was clear. They walked in, they observed, they walked out. They carried weights that broke lesser men through terrain that tested the strongest. They moved at speeds that seemed absurdly slow, covered distances that seemed impossibly short, and they walked home alive while helicopter-inserted units counted casualties that sometimes reached 60%. This wasn't just about Australian tactics versus American doctrine. It was about understanding terrain, understanding enemy capabilities, understanding that technology was a tool, not a solution. The Viet Cong couldn't ambush what they couldn't hear, couldn't prepare for what they couldn't predict, couldn't wait at landing zones if soldiers never landed there. Morrison would conduct 23 more patrols during his Vietnam service. Everyone followed the same pattern: insertion to cold landing zone, approach march on foot, Mission execution, withdrawal on foot, extraction from secured land. Everyone returned with zero casualty from insertion or extraction. Several would involve contact with the enemy during the mission itself, firefights that erupted when compromise occurred, or targets presented themselves. But those contacts were on Australian, with surprise and position in their favor. The statistics told the story that words struggled to capture. American airmobile units conducting hot landing zone insertions faced casualty rates between 40 and 60% when the enemy was prepared and waiting. Australian SAS patrols conducting walk-in operations recorded zero casualties from insertion and extraction throughout their deployment in Phu Oc Tuy province. The difference wasn't courage or training or equipment. The difference was doctrine, philosophy, the choice between speed and stealth. Years later, military analysts would study the Vietnam War, trying to understand what worked and what failed, what lessons could be extracted from jungles that swallowed armies. The helicopter would remain central to military operations, its capabilities too valuable to abandon. But the Australian SAS experience would inform how those helicopters were used, when speed was appropriate and when stealth was essential, when technology provided advantage and when it created vulnerability. Morrison retired from the Army in 1975, carrying memories of jungles and patrols, of weights that never got lighter and distances that never got short. He carried memories of men who walked when they could have flown, who chose suffering over speed, who understood that survival sometimes meant doing things the hard way. He carried memories of helicopter sounds 3 kilometers away, of AK-47 fire that marked where men had died because their doctrine valued speed over surprise. The question that had started everything, Wright's question in the briefing tent, had a simple answer that took 7 days of experience to truly understand. Why walk instead of using helicopters? Because walking meant arriving unannounced, undetected, unknown. Because walking meant the enemy couldn't prepare, couldn't ambush, couldn't wait at landing zone. Because walking meant 45-kilogram packs and 3-day approach marches and physical suffering that tested every limit. Because walking meant zero casualties from insertion when helicopter units were taking 60% losses. Because walking meant coming home alive. The Australian SAS in Vietnam had proven something that technology enthusiasts often forgot. Sometimes the old ways were old because they worked, and sometimes the hard way was hard because it was right. They had proven that boots on the ground moved slower than helicopters, but arrived quieter than silence. They had proven that patience was a weapon, that surprise was armor, that stealth was speed measured in survival instead of kilometers per hour. In the end, the statistics were irrefutable. Zero casualties from hot landing zone insertions achieved by the simple expedient of not conducting hot insertion. Survival rates that exceeded every other unit operating in similar terrain, achieved by accepting physical hardship and operational limitations. Mission success rates that justified the doctrine achieved by men who walked when others flew, who chose boots over rotors, who understood that in jungle warfare, the way you arrived determined whether you survived. The helicopters continued to fly, their rotors beating the air into submission, their sound carrying kilometers to enemy ears. And the Australian SAS continued to walk, their boots marking paths through jungle that swallowed sound, their silence buying surprise that saved lives. Two doctrines, two philosophies, two different answers to the same question. How do you insert soldiers into hostile territory? The Americans chose speed, the Australians chose stealth, and the casualty rates told everyone which choice led home. If you found this story of tactical doctrine and survival illuminating, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into military history and the decisions that determined life and death in combat. Leave a like if this changed how you think about technology and tactics, and drop a comment sharing what lesson from the Australian SAS experience resonates with you most. Thanks for watching.